Good morning, my fellow scientists. It's Sunday, February 12th, and I want to talk about fiction today. I'm taking a travel day tomorrow, so no updates on Monday, but while I'm driving, I'm going to be listening to a book of the Wheel of Time series, which I know I'll enjoy. If you haven't read it, it's a ridiculously long epic series in the sort of vein of Game of Thrones, but with more magic and more ridiculousness. One of the tropes in this genre generally, but in Wheel of Time especially, is that there are special characters who wrap the fate of the world around themselves, that the coincidence and craziness follow these characters as the threads of people's lives are woven around them. And that's another funny way of saying that these characters are essentially main characters around whom main character events are going to happen. And it's amusing to replace the fancy word that they use in the series, ta'veren, which essentially means main character, with main character. Because you're like, well, of course that's going to happen. He's a main character. So, yeah, sometimes crazy coincidence happen and the right person shows up at the right time to solve the problem because he's ta'veren. I mean, the main character. I mean, whatever. It's sort of ridiculous, but it's fun to read. But what I've been thinking about these series, and it applies to Wheel of Time and Game of Thrones and even Star Wars and other Star Trek, is that there are main characters who matter. And then there are the small folk, the red coats, the moisture farmers who don't matter. And that's kind of a cynical view that's just accepted as part of this genre. And I think it's interesting that we like these stories, or at least I like these stories, and yet I'm not really comfortable with that assessment of what is important and what isn't, who is important and who isn't. I don't know that the moisture farmers and the small folk are unimportant. I mean, collectively, they're the most important. You can't have a Game of Thrones unless you have farmers out making the grain that makes the bread and cake and fancy food that all these people are eating. You can't have a galaxy full of spaceships unless you have people to fly them, most of whom are never featured on camera. And I know that's an over-analysis of a trivially constructed world, but often those constructed worlds reflect a view, intentionally or unintentionally, of how the world works. And in this case, I think we accept a little blindly that the world works for and by the intention of big people, and that small people are irrelevant, when collectively that's an unfair presumption. Anyway, science is an interesting analogy, right? Because the big scientists who are remembered, whose names are in front of the principles and equations we use today, these scientists didn't happen in a vacuum. They were collaborating with others. They were working with the small folk. The graduate students and postdocs do a lot of the work, and the famous scientists maybe unfairly get the name and the influence. The world isn't fair, and I don't know that it's reasonable to say it should be, but it's interesting to think about that we resonate with the main characters of these stories because we imagine ourselves to be the commander of our fate, but despite resonating with those, most of us are the small folk, and that's okay too. Anyway, weird thoughts, reading silly fiction. Tune in tomorrow, Tuesday, and we'll talk about science and results and microfluidics and aptamers and all manner of fun things here in the Allen Lab.